Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first ACS Summer Reading List Book Talk and our first ACS Pre-Convention program. My name is Peggy Lee. I'm the Director of Chapters at ACS, and I'm so excited to welcome you to today's book talk on Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley, and the Struggle for Equality. Civil Rights Queen is written by Tomiko Brown-Nagin, the Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, one of the world's leading centers for interdisciplinary research across the humanities, sciences, social sciences, arts, and professions. She is also the Daniel P.S. Paul Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School and a Professor of History at Harvard University. Dean Brown-Nagin is an award-winning legal historian and an expert in constitutional law and educational law and policy. In 2019, she was appointed chair of the Presidential Committee on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery. The committee's report resulted in Harvard's commitment of $100 million to address harms to descendant communities in the United States and in the Caribbean. Her new book, Civil Rights Queen, explores the life and times of Constance Baker Motley, a path-breaking lawyer, politician, and the first Black woman to be appointed to the federal bench. Dean Brown-Nagin will be in conversation with Christina Beeler, an ACS Houston lawyer chapter leader and ACS Next Generation leader, and a former student board member on the ACS National Board of Directors. She is also a past winner of the Constance Baker Motley National Student Writing Competition, which is hosted by ACS and the University of Pennsylvania Law School, in honor of Constance Baker Motley's legacy and commitment to equality for all. Christina Beeler is also one of my former ACS student leaders. I still remember working with her when she was a 1L at the University of Houston Law Center. Since we met in 2015, Christina Beeler has been an EJW Fellow working at the Juvenile and Children's Advocacy Project. She clerked with the Honorable Gray H. Miller for the United States District Court for the Southern District of Texas. She served as an assistant county attorney for the Harris County Attorney's Office, and she is now a voting rights staff attorney at the Texas Civil Rights Project. Now, before the book talk begins, I want to quickly note that our next ACS Summer Reading List book talk will be on Monday, June 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern on the book Manifesting Justice, Wrongly Convicted Women Reclaim Their Rights by Valina Beatty. She'll be in conversation with Christina Sworns, the Executive Director of the Innocence Project. To learn more about our book talks, pre-convention activities, and national convention, please check out our ACS National Convention page. Now, Dean Tomiko Brown-Nagin will begin with a short reading from her book, Civil Rights Queen.
Thank you, Peggy, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the American Constitution Society for hosting me today. I'm excited to be in conversation with Christina following my reading. The reading is taken from the chapter in my book on Constance Baker Motley's most famous case, and that was the battle to desegregate the University of Mississippi. This man has got to be crazy, Thurgood Marshall yelled to Motley in January of 1961. That's your case. Marshall had descended upon Motley's office waving a letter from James Meredith. The missive contained such a preposterous idea that Marshall thought the writer must be out of his mind. I am submitting an application for admission to the University of Mississippi, Meredith wrote, and I am anticipating encountering difficulty with the various agencies here in the state. In view of the brewing trouble, Meredith requested Marshall's legal assistance. After Marshall finished laughing about Meredith's proposal to sue Ole Miss, he washed his hands of the case. Marshall knew that Motley had the smarts and the courtroom skills to do the job, and he thought her gender would be an advantage. The fight to desegregate Ole Miss might get someone killed, but in the context of Mississippi's white supremacist yet chivalrous culture, as Marshall saw it, a Black woman would fare better than a Black man. Any white supremacist, he opined, would scarcely think twice about murdering a Black man, but might hesitate to lynch a Black woman. The very idea of a Black woman lawyer violently clashed with the worldview of Dugas Shands Esquire, the white male lawyer who defended Ole Miss. Shands refused to address the Ink Fund lawyer in the customary manner as Mrs. Motley. Instead, he used only indirect references, calling Motley her or she. At one point early on, Motley jumped to her feet in a bid to put an end to the charade. But the tipping point occurred when Shands called her Constance. Motley immediately objected. "I would like for Mr. Shands not to call me by my first name," Motley insisted. Henceforth, the lawyer referred to Motley as the New York counsel. After months of struggle and endless delays, Meredith had had enough. Browbeaten by white resistance, Meredith wrote to Motley, resigned. "I will not attempt to obtain an undergraduate degree from the University of Mississippi," the letter proclaimed. Keenly aware that Motley, who had poured herself into the case, would be disappointed in his decision, Meredith pleaded for understanding. "I am human after all," he wrote. Meredith had grown tired of waiting for a deliverance that never came. Life had passed him by. His peers had graduated from college, begun careers, and moved on with their lives. In the meantime, he and his family had endured a high cost, fighting to integrate the University of Mississippi. Motley was stunned by the message. In order to salvage her case and support her client, she morphed from lawyer to therapist, a role she often played in high-stakes civil rights cases. To get a handle on the fraught situation, the pair would talk in Motley's New York City apartment, where Meredith could taste freedom. There, Motley cajoled Meredith. She persuaded him that he had gone too far and that too much had been invested in the case by the Inc. Fund and the Federal Court of Appeals to abandon the litigation. Just as Meredith reached his breaking point, support arrived, precisely as Motley had promised. On September 10th, 1962, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black intervened, halting any further action preventing James Meredith's matriculation to Ole Miss. While in Mississippi, Motley built community with a small band of lawyers and activists who took part in LDF's effort to end Jim Crow in the state. She leaned on Medgar Evers, the NAACP's most prominent operative in Mississippi, who often invited Motley to his home, where she enjoyed home-cooked meals and fellowship with Evers, his wife Merle, and their children. Only 1 month after Motley left Mississippi for the last time, Medgar Evers was assassinated. It devastated her. Motley couldn't get out of her bed for weeks following his death. She couldn't even bring herself to attend his funeral. Nevertheless, she had left the state victorious. Constance Baker Motley emerged as one of the most respected lawyers in America. A story in the New York Times titled "Integration's Advocate" captured the professional heights to which Motley has soared. A tall, striking woman with piercing dark eyes is almost always in the courtroom and the eye of a hurricane surrounding the struggle for civil rights in the South, the article read. Motley's fight to desegregate Ole Miss brought her public esteem and professional success, along with devastating loss and profound pain. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that powerful reading, Dean Brown-Nagin, and thank you for joining us today. For our audience, if you have a question for the Dean about Civil Rights Queen, please use the Q&A box. We'll try to incorporate as many of your questions as possible into our conversation. So Dean Brown-Nagin, I am so excited to talk with you today about this incredible book, which is not only deeply and thoroughly researched and resourced, but incredibly beautifully written. And as a former English teacher and an avid reader, I read a lot of books. And this book was such a joy to read, both because of the new coverage it brings to historical events that I thought I knew all about, and because it's riveting. I was literally reading this book with a book light until midnight, several nights in a row, because it's so fascinating. So I'm going to do my best not to fangirl out because I am a huge fan of your writing. And let's jump right into some questions.
Sure.
Dean Brown-Nagin, why did you decide to write this book and where did you get the idea for it?
That's a great question. And thank you for the comments about the book. I decided to write this book after writing a book about Atlanta and the long history of the civil rights movement. That book's called Courage to Dissent. I completed a chapter in that book that was about Motley in part because she litigated the Atlanta school desegregation case all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was in the context of researching and writing for that book that I realized that there was relatively little scholarship on Constance Baker Motley. And I was surprised, and I thought that She needed a full biography. She deserved a full biography, and that as many people as possible should know about her. And that's why I decided to write the book.
Reading about this trailblazing Black woman who was a first-generation American and first-generation law student from a working-class background, and how she not only contributed to building the architecture of civil rights in this country, but went on to be several firsts. The first Black woman elected to the New York Senate, the first Black woman elected Manhattan Borough President, and the first Black woman appointed to the federal bench. I was surprised to learn that Constance Baker Motley's life had not been given this thorough treatment before your book was published. Were you surprised that there were just 2 books written about her, including her own autobiography? And why do you think there was such a lack of coverage for her life?
Well, Christina, it is surprising that someone who had such a tremendous impact on the world in which we live today, who helped bring about the Second Reconstruction, would have so little attention paid to her contributions. And this is true even in the context of books about, say, Thurgood Marshall, of which there are many, just very little attention to Constance Baker Motley. And so the question is, why? And I'm afraid it's down to race and gender. In Western societies, including in the civil rights scholarship, leadership is essentially coded male. And thus, many women who deserve our attention have not received it. In fact, it's only relatively recently that someone like Pauli Murray, Ella Baker have received their due with full biographies. And I thought it was important to do the same for Motley because she truly had a tremendous impact. And I also wanted to make gender a theme of analysis, a category of analysis in the book, because it's still relevant to leadership today, to the experience of working women, including professional women. And I thought it was important to shine a light on Constance Baker Motley.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, reading this book, I felt it in my soul as a woman, just reading about the things she experienced and her career. And you open the book with a poem that Constance Baker wrote when she was 15 years old that I personally found so moving. Where and how did you find this poem, and why did you open the book with it?
That's a great question, and because it allows me to highlight how some things about the publication of the book just occurred by chance. So towards the end, in fact, during the publication process, that is when the publisher was getting everything all together and was about to have it bound, Constance Baker Motley's daughter-in-law sent me this poem, which had been read at her memorial service, and said you might be interested in this. And I was very interested in it because it is so prescient, it's so deep. It suggests just how precocious she was at 15 years old. And it's a poem, for those who haven't had the benefit of reading the book yet, that is all about the disadvantage that she sees in her neighborhood. And she describes the disadvantage in the context of God creating the world. It was terrific and says so much about her. She was on a mission and formed her political consciousness as a teenager, growing up during the 1930s, during the Great Depression. That her career was rooted in that experience. And I thought it was important to show that through the poem at the very beginning of the book.
Yeah, when I read that poem, I thought it must have come from some literary giant. And then I saw that she had written, and I thought, oh my gosh, wow, this really illustrates how incredible she is.
Yes.
And we have a question from the audience. Where does your book differ from Judge Motley's book?
Well, Judge Motley's book is an autobiography. It was a great source for me. And yet my book is very different in terms of its coverage, because it includes a reflection on her personal life, including her marriage, her relationship with her child, questions of work-life balance, and situates the legal cases and her political career in context, describing many of the change makers that she met along the way, whereas Motley's autobiography it really focuses on legal cases, and is not that, it doesn't reflect very much on the nature of her experiences. And so they're very different, as you would expect.
And speaking of change makers that she met along the way, Motley's legacy as a civil rights queen was deeply intertwined with Mr. Civil Rights himself, Justice Thurgood Marshall. Can you talk to us? Sorry. Echo. There is an echo. Sorry, give me 1 second. Sometimes that helps. Can you talk to us about their relationship and about the ways in which he impacted her life by hiring her and mentoring her? And can you also touch on Justice Marshall's decision to push for the appointment of Jack Greenberg as the head of LDF instead of Constance Baker Motley?
Sure. It was the most important relationship in her legal career, easily. He did hire her on the spot in 1945, even before she had graduated from Columbia Law School, when she appeared at the headquarters of LDF looking for a job as an intern. He could see that she was smart and wanted her to be a part of his team. And it's important to note that in hiring her on the spot, Thurgood Marshall was behaving and reacting in a way that was very different from the white male law firm partners, for instance, who essentially closed the door in her face when she appeared seeking a job. And this was an experience common to women of the era, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sandra Day O'Connor, and so forth. He mentored Motley. They had great respect and affection for one another. And that was true throughout their lives, and true despite the fact that, as I describe in the book, Motley was disappointed when she was passed over for the position of Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund once Marshall left. And I should say, Christina, that the point of that discussion is not to say that Motley should have gotten the job over Jack Greenberg, although she certainly was qualified. I'm sure she would have done a terrific job. In fact, he did a terrific job. The point is to show how gender shaped her experience and to prioritize her life among those lawyers. And it was a setback. She thought that gender had very much to do with why she was passed over, that Thurgood Marshall did not have the imagination to put a woman in such a powerful position. And he was hardly alone. There weren't women leading nonprofits of that caliber at the time, for instance, at the ACLU. And so it was a disappointment, but it also was one that motivated in part her entry into politics, which I think was a terrific departure for her, and one that showed her wide talent and her versatility as a lawyer.
Mm-hmm. And this book is so rich with examples of Constance Baker Motley's versatility as a lawyer and her lifelong commitment to equality for all. And of course, this struggle for equality manifests differently at different stages of her life and career, and we can't possibly cover them all today, but I wanted to talk about a few examples. So her first trial in Mississippi was a challenge to unequal pay for Black teachers. Can you talk about that case and how it influenced her personal battle for equal pay at LDF?
Well, it was ironic that after Motley went to Jackson, Mississippi to fight for against discrimination on behalf of Black teachers who were paid less regardless of their qualifications. She marched into Thurgood Marshall's office to say that she didn't think she was being paid what she should. And he did raise her salary and gave her a different title. And so he did the right thing ultimately. And yet it's another example of blind spots, even among progressives, blind spots as to gender in this case. And just one more thing about the Jackson, Mississippi case, it was eye-opening for her and frightening to be in the state of Mississippi, which had a reputation as the most racist state in the country, and for good reason. She was mistreated, disrespected, even by lawyers in the courtroom and judges who shared segregationist views. And I was so happy to be able to discuss that case and show how it is a microcosm of her experiences as a pioneering Black woman lawyer.
And where do you think she got the strength to keep going every single time she was disrespected in the courtroom? I mean, when I read those examples that you're talking about in your book, I thought, oh my God, to be treated like this in a courtroom, especially after everything she had accomplished. Where do you think she found the strength? What do you think kept her going when those things happened?
Right. I would say that it was her experiences growing up in New Haven in a supportive family of immigrants from the West Indies, the island of Nevis, who were working class and yet quite proud and principled. They were culturally conservative, socially conservative, and even, I will say, the father thought that he and all West Indians were superior to African Americans. And I mention that because I do believe that that sense of superiority was a kind of protective shell for Motley when she went into the South and encountered this outrageous behavior. She didn't understand how someone like Dugas Shands, this lawyer in the Ole Miss case, could fail to appreciate how terrific she was, essentially, right? She knew it. She had been taught that she had so much to contribute, although I should mention that no one thought she could or should be a lawyer, pursue law school, because it was just fanciful for someone of her race, class, and gender. And yet she had that spirit, that resilience from growing up in that context. In New Haven, where she attended desegregated schools, by the way. And so she found strength in her community.
And going back to her cases, we all know about Thurgood Marshall's connection to Brown v. Board of Education, but not many people know about Motley's essential role. What role did she play, and why didn't she really get recognition for it?
It's a complicated story, and one that I was happy to tell, not only because it places Motley in the room, in the making of Brown versus Board of Education, of course, by consensus, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, 20th century constitutional law case. But it also shows how, again, gender shaped her professional career, even as she achieved so much. So as to the question of what Motley did, she wrote the original complaint in Brown versus Board of Education. That was used by other lawyers in the 5 cases that were litigated in the federal courts. And so in a real way, her intellectual handiwork is the basis for all of the litigation. She helped do research for the briefs in Brown versus Board of Education, helped write the briefs, supported the work in any number of ways. She did not argue any of the cases. And so, of course, the lawyers, all male, who argued the cases are the ones who received the greatest plaudits and fame, certainly Thurgood Marshall, from that. And yet she was so vital, even though, as I explain in the book, during the same period that she and the other lawyers were litigating and then relitigating Brown at the Supreme Court, she gave birth and was caring for her infant son, and took a maternity leave, came back. And so she was juggling her personal life and her career in a way that was uncommon. She was the only woman in the office. And I thought it was really important to show all of that in the context of contributions to Brown versus Board of Education.
Yeah, I found that so fascinating. As someone who had a baby during law school, I was reading that and I just really found that information just so riveting to hear about her experience and thinking about trying to juggle Brown v. Board of Education and having a baby. Wow.
Yes.
And the struggle for equality. Oh, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
I just want to say, Christina, I hope it was validating.
It was.
One of the reasons I included it is because it's a common experience for working women, for all parents, but obviously for women, the struggle is different, and it contributes to women not being able to get ahead as they should in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. And when I was reading it, I was thinking about how many people asked me during law school, where's your baby going to go during the day? Well, daycare, like that's where children, but no one asked my husband.
Right.
So I was thinking about the backlash that she may have received. Did you see anything about that in your research? How people treated her having a baby in the middle of such an impressive, important career when she was the only female in so many spaces?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do not have direct evidence that the lawyers with whom she was working pushed back. And yet there's plenty of evidence that she was violating a social norm by even being in the workplace, setting aside the having a baby part, right? She did not belong. She was not thought to belong in a high-powered legal office. And then to add the fact of her pregnancy, maternity leave, and returning to the office to that just says so much about the relative progressiveness of the Inc. Fund. Thurgood Marshall had her back. She remained a part of the team, as well as just the disadvantage that she faced.
Yeah. And the struggle for equality exacted a personal toll on everyone involved in fighting for it, including obviously Constance Baker Motley and the plaintiffs themselves. You described some of the threats and state-sanctioned violence in the chapter about the long fight to integrate Ole Miss. What did you learn about the costs of this struggle to Motley and to James Meredith, the first Black man to enroll at the university?
This is such an important part of the book. You know, when we think about these landmark civil rights cases, we think about oftentimes the triumph, and the lawyers are represented as gladiators fighting for justice, and that's a fine narrative about these cases, and true to some extent. But there also was pain and trauma that went along with litigating these cases in the Deep South, where Motley was under threat of her life, as was James Meredith. I recount how there were instances of Motley traveling with Medgar Evers back and forth from the airport to the courthouse, and he would say to her, put away your legal pad. The police are following us. And you didn't want to be caught with evidence that you were fighting against the system of segregation in Mississippi. And so it was harrowing. James Meredith faltered. She had to support him. And yet she continued, like I said, because of her training, also because she knew that she was on a mission. She understood that she was making history, and she was willing to make sacrifices personally because of that.
And speaking of personal sacrifices, and in keeping with talking about her life as a working mother, in one point in the book, you wrote, during her many trips to Mississippi, Motley often wondered if she would hold her son and husband again. That, oh my gosh, that line. I mean, it made me tear up thinking about even right now. I mean, as a mother, that really hit me, what it must have been like for her, the personal toll. How do you think she managed the fear and anxiety she must have had over her physical safety? And the emotional and physical toll of working for so long on such challenging cases. And if you could also specifically speak to the death of Medgar Evers and how that really took a toll on her, and how did she keep going? How did she manage all of this?
That is a good question, and I'm not sure that there is a succinct answer to that, because of course the point of telling those stories is that sometimes she came close to not managing. It was difficult for her, as it would be for any human being, to be under such stress. And the point about physical exhaustion is important too. She actually, Christina, lost weight often when she traveled, because as a Black lawyer, she wasn't able to eat in white-owned restaurants or stay in white-owned hotels. She and the lawyers had to depend on the kindness of people like Medgar Evers, whom they had met along the way. And so it was difficult, but the sense of mission, the sense that she was fighting and would be on the right side of history, I think helped her. The community helped her. Being a part of a group of people who were fighting for change was vitally important for the civil rights lawyers, for the student activists, for everyone who was involved in that struggle. And that a member of her community, her support network, Medgar Evers, was assassinated by a white man who hid in hedges near his house, was just devastating, in part because she had warned him to cut those hedges, saying that someone could do you harm by hiding there. And that's precisely what happened. And it was so difficult for her. And I share your sense of just pain over this. I have read that passage quite a few times, and every time I do, I get a lump in my throat at just thinking about his death and what it did to his family, and also just the pain of losing someone, and losing them at the end of the battle, at the conclusion of the battle, when she thought that she was done. And then to have him cut down like that as such a young man is just, it's something to consider.
Yeah. And after her long fight in Mississippi, so this is kind of switching gears a little bit. After her long fight in Mississippi, Motley had made a name for herself as one of the most important civil rights lawyers of her time, which put her in a position to push for equality in a different arena, politics. Can you describe some of her accomplishments in her career as a politician?
Right. She achieved a first as the first Black woman to be elected to the New York Senate. In the context of her short career there, she fought against the no-knock practice of the police, which continues to be an issue. She understood that it gave rise to abuse in the criminal legal system. She fought in the Senate, but also as Manhattan Borough President, where she was the first woman elected, for social programs and for the funding of social programs to help lower income women and families. And she was a symbol of what women might accomplish in politics, that she prevailed. There were plenty of people who, Christina, in New York, men, who were not that happy that she had won those offices. They didn't think that she was the best representative or an authentic representative even of African Americans, whom she in part represented when she was Manhattan Borough President. And so it was a moment in her career that I think really shows how talented she was, that she could pull that off. She was not a naturally, she was naturally a reserved person. And when one thinks about politicians, of course, one thinks of being extroverted and glad handing. She had to stretch to walk the streets of Harlem and to get to know people in the neighborhood. She was accustomed to being the person who was representing all of those people in court, which of course is a different experience. And so for that reason alone, I thought it was important to talk about that part of her career.
Which all speaks to how incredible she was, that she was able to move through so many important spaces and make a difference in so many different ways. And that brings me to the next question. In 1966, Motley became the first Black woman to serve as a federal judge. After working so long to establish civil rights through targeted litigation, she was then in a position herself to interpret new civil rights laws and extend their protections to all, including groups of people she'd never advocated for as an attorney: white women, people in prison, people who were or who appeared to be experiencing homelessness. But at the same time, you described that many ordinary people with discrimination claims did not find the receptive audience they expected to get with her as their judge. What did her work as a judge tell you about her approach to adjudicating civil rights from the bench, and about assumptions about personal identity, particularly for women and people of color, and judicial philosophy?
So there's so much there, Christina, so much to unpack. And what I will say is that identity is important symbolically. The representation of women and people of color and other marginalized identities on the bench is important, including because people who are qualified deserve to be considered, and yet does not necessarily translate into substantive representation. And that is the story that I tell about Motley's career on the bench. So there were important cases in which she ruled as people in the civil rights and women's rights communities thought or hoped that she would when she was appointed. So she ruled for Melissa Lutkey, who was a female journalist who had been shut out of the locker room in Major League Baseball, who sued and won in Motley's courtroom. And she was integral to the ability of women to be hired by lucrative sectors of the legal profession through a case called Blank versus Sullivan and Cromwell. And yet, as you say, in other cases that didn't involve prominent or high profile plaintiffs or plaintiffs in professional positions, the outcomes in her courtroom don't look significantly different from in anyone else's courtroom. And so she applied the law as she thought was required, but she was not a judge who was who failed to understand the distinction between the role of an advocate and the role of a judge. So in those employment discrimination cases, she was limited by precedent. And she, having litigated for so many years, she knew a good case from a bad one. And so it was hard to make those cases, those claims, to substantiate them. And Motley, she called them like she saw them. And I think that is a terrific legacy to have built as a judge.
And for a woman who accomplished so many things for which there were no templates or exemplars, it's hard to imagine that she might have felt she could have done more. But were there things that she left unfinished or things she wished she could have accomplished?
Interesting question. I think that she wanted to be promoted to the Second Circuit and was not happy that she wasn't promoted. As I explain in the book, President Johnson initially wanted to seat her on the Second Circuit and just received tremendous pushback at that idea and pushback at the idea of appointing her to the Southern District of New York, the, of course, prestigious court in Manhattan, where the judges hear a lot of financial cases. There were claims that as a civil rights lawyer, she couldn't handle those cases. And her identity was weaponized against her and was a reason that she was not elevated. And although it's not something she fixated on, because as you rightly say, she achieved so much. And yet I do think that she, as I described it, was unhappy with that. And yet it was not down to her, right? It was down to the presidents and the senators who had it within their power to promote her.
And now, more than 55 years later, Ketanji Brown Jackson will be the first Black woman to sit on the Supreme Court of the United States. Let me mute myself again. That should fix it. Can you talk a bit about the importance of representation and seeing the possible reflected in every level of government, and what Constance Baker Motley understood about how meaningful it was for others to see her in such important roles?
Yes, Constance Baker Motley, of course, paved the way for Associate Justice Jackson, as the justice herself mentioned when she was introduced to the country after President Biden nominated her to the court. And Motley understood that visible diversity was vitally important. And the reason she gave, though, Christina, goes back to the distinction between representation and substantive representation. She argued that diversity was important because it promoted a belief in government itself, that our government is fair because anyone who is qualified can be promoted and can hold those high positions. And that was the value she attached to her own ascension to the court, to her election to the Manhattan Borough Presidency. She understood when she went into the South and saw African Americans lining the courtroom, so excited to see her standing up to white supremacists. She understood that that was powerful. And indeed it is. We saw that anew with the nomination of Justice Jackson. I'm thrilled about that, although it is the case that given the makeup of the court, a supermajority, conservative supermajority, one can't expect Justice Jackson to just change the world or be in the majority in cases that matter to women and people of color. And yet it's her being in the room is important nevertheless.
Absolutely. And what, if any, parallels did you see between Constance Baker Motley's confirmation process and Ketanji Brown Jackson's? What were the notable differences? What similarities did you see?
Well, the biggest difference is that in contrast to what I was saying about Motley not being promoted to the Second Circuit, Justice Jackson was in fact confirmed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's something that is so significant and a triumph in our politics. There are similarities too, as I wrote about and commented on during the nomination process. There were those who sought to weaponize Justice Jackson's practice identity against her by pointing to her having served as a public defender as somehow problematic, her defending Guantanamo, people confined at Guantanamo as somehow problematic. And of course, nothing could be farther from the truth if one believes in our constitutional system. And that's the argument that I made. As I was describing before, the same move was tried against Motley, with people claiming that what in fact was something to be celebrated, her role as a civil rights lawyer, was alleged to be a source of bias. And yet I am pleased that 50 years later, Judge Jackson was able to be confirmed, and her ascension to the U.S. Supreme Court is a validation of Motley and her legacy.
And were there things that Baker Motley herself didn't share in her autobiography that you thought were important to tell the world in your book?
Well, quite a lot. She did not discuss her family or her spouse very much, and I thought it was important to cover those subjects in my book. After all, I wanted to talk about the full human being, and her private life was a part of that. She did not really discuss in her autobiography her role in mentoring a new generation of lawyers. And I thought it important to talk about that as well. Lawyers and judges. She supported women judges who came on the bench after her, including people like Kemba Wood, now Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who joined the Southern District as Motley took senior status. It's important to know about that as well, how she gave to others, although she didn't have that experience herself. She didn't have the kind of template or role models very much that she was willing to be for her clerks and for other women judges. And I thought it important to cover that because it speaks how lovely of a human being she was.
Yeah. And that comes across so well in your book, how lovely of a person she was, in addition to being such an accomplished, incredible lawyer, politician, judge. And many of the people joining us today are law students, lawyers, or people considering law school during another incredibly challenging time in our country's history. As you spoke about the supermajority on the Supreme Court, obviously you are well aware of all the things that everyone is thinking about when we're talking about the incredibly challenging time that we're facing today. What do you think that civil rights lawyers and young law students can learn from Constance Baker Motley about resilience and continuing the work even when things seem bleak?
Yes, they can learn quite a lot. Of course, when she started, there was no reason to believe that the NAACP lawyers would be able to kill Jim Crow. You know, Charles Hamilton Houston, who was one of the architects of the Brown strategy, known as the man who killed Jim Crow. And who would have thought? And so that is to say, if they could take on that challenge and prevail over time, then surely we who are confronted with new challenges can get to work. And another lesson of Motley's life and career is that there are many roles to play in social change. And she, as we've been discussing, she was a rights lawyer, she was a politician, she was a judge. There are many roles, and There's a lesson in that for students, and so many other lessons. Perhaps one that I will stress now is the idea of having the courage of one's convictions. The courage of one's convictions. The case, one of the cases that she rolled in involving Martin Sostre, who was a jailhouse lawyer and a catalyst of the prisoner rights movement, brought a case arguing that solitary confinement violated the Eighth Amendment. She decided for him. It was a courageous thing to do. And she did it knowing that she likely would be reversed because she thought it was the right thing to do. And I just believe that we have to have courage in that way. And Motley's life shows us how to do that.
I think that's absolutely true. I was thinking about this the whole time I was reading it as a civil rights lawyer in Texas, about how her life really demonstrates how we have to keep up the fight. And I wanted to ask you, one of the things I found so shocking in this book was the important role that the Fifth Circuit played in some of the victories that Constance Baker Motley and her clients had. Do you think there's a way for us all to still have hope, knowing that the judiciary has changed so much since this time? Or has it changed in also really good ways? I mean, what do you think of the judiciary today versus when Constance Baker Motley was litigating? And what do you think she would say about the things that are happening today?
A lot there. First of all, the judiciary, the federal judiciary, is more diverse and inclusive today than ever before, and we ought not forget that. Even though it is true that on the Supreme Court there's a supermajority, the bench is diverse in ways that Motley would not have imagined, because there are civil rights lawyers who have been confirmed as federal judges and public defenders. This is a very recent phenomenon and an important phenomenon. And yet Motley would be disappointed that some of the foundational principles in law for which she fought, including voting rights, have been undermined recently. And yet she was a fundamentally optimistic person. She would have to have been to do what she did against the odds. And so I would encourage individuals to take from her life and the lives of many of our heroes that one is to keep going. You know, Motley, one of the things that she said that I found so telling and inspiring is that she was a woman who would not be put down, which is to say she was resilient. She would not stop. She just kept going and found new ways to fight for change. And I commend that attitude to others.
And we have a question from the audience. Do you think Constance Baker Motley could have achieved those same victories today in the Fifth Circuit or elsewhere?
So that's what we historians call it, a counterfactual. It's hard to answer that question. I do think that knowing that the courts are not necessarily the validators of minority interests in the ways that a case like Brown versus Board of Education taught, that it's important to be active in any number of spaces at the state and the local level, in politics, as well as in the courts. The courts are not the only answer when one is seeking change, although I appreciate the value that people attach to that particular arena of struggle.
And do you know if if Judge Constance Baker Motley had an opinion on originalism? That's a question from the audience.
Well, not in the fashion that it's discussed today. I would say that there's a sense in which everyone, of course, should be an originalist if that means trying to understand the history surrounding the Constitution. The question is, to what extent one fixates on that methodology when professional historians, for instance, would say that one can actually find the answer to the question at hand by looking at the history, the public meaning of phrases. That's the question. It's not originalism at base is not necessarily something to be feared or questioned. It is the way in which the idea is applied. And I certainly think as a law professor that one needs to be using a variety of methodologies to get to the answer to hard questions. And I certainly believe that Motley would think the same way. She was a person who valued history greatly. And of course, the lawyers in the cases in Brown, for instance, looked to history, the original meaning of the 14th Amendment as they were litigating the case. And turns out that according to Chief Justice Warren, it was inconclusive on the particular question at hand surrounding schools. And this is how we got to an opinion that was willing to push the law in part by invoking social context, social science. So that's my response to that question.
Thank you. And we have one last audience question. Are there efforts underway to tell her story through movies or TV shows?
Important question. And I am in discussions with some individuals about a documentary based on my book. There was a documentary called The Trials of Constance Baker Motley that was released years ago by her son. It's terrific, terrific telling of a part of her life. And I would love to see a motion picture based on her life one day. And I hope that the new prominence that she is receiving these days will give rise to precisely that, because it's a terrific medium for reaching broad audiences.
Yeah, I also hope so. Oh my gosh, I would love to see her story in a film. Her story has been so inspiring to me personally, and I'm sure to so many other people on this call. Thank you, Dean Brown-Nagin, so much for your time today. It has been an absolute joy speaking with you. I am such a huge fan of both you and Constance Baker Motley. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Christina. It has been my pleasure to talk to you. Take care.